Hello, and welcome to the Pediatric Brain Tumor Foundation's webinar, part 2 of navigating social skill challenges after a pediatric brain tumor diagnosis. My name is Kathy Riley, and I'm the Vice President of Family Support for the Pediatric Brain Tumor Foundation. We are honored to have you joining us today for this important webinar. The PBTF provides programs and resources to support families facing a pediatric brain tumor diagnosis throughout their journeys. We will provide links to some of those programs and resources at the end of today's webinar. But before we get started, I have a couple of guidelines to review. You're muted for this webinar and your video is disabled, but we welcome questions during and after the opening remarks. Please type your questions into the Q&A feature found at the bottom of the Zoom window. We will not get to every question today, but we'll try to answer as many questions as possible. Today, we'll hear from our presenter, Dr. Victoria Willard, then Heather Held, our National Family Support Programs Manager, will host the Q&A portion of our webinar. Our next slide. Victoria Willard is a licensed pediatric psychologist and assistant member in the Department of Psychology at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. Her research program focuses on social and emotional development in children with cancer. She has a particular interest in the impact of diagnosis at the key developmental stages of early childhood, adolescence, and young adulthood. Much of her work to date has focused on identifying the factors that influence social functioning and peer relationships in children with brain tumors to find opportunities to intervene. It gives me the greatest pleasure to welcome back for a second time for our webinar series, Dr. Victoria Willard. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathy, for that introduction, and I hope you all can hear me. As Kathy said, my name is Dr. Tori Willard, and I'm a pediatric psychologist and actually now associate member in psychology at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. And I first gave a webinar on this topic for the Pediatric Brain Tumor Foundation back in October. And given the response to that initial talk, and we had such a wonderful conversation in the webinar or the Q&A after the talk, we decided to schedule a part 2 to really continue our conversation on this incredibly important topic. So next slide, please. So the Pediatric Brain Tumor Foundation has asked me to cover 4 objectives today. First, to describe the social skills challenges that children face following the diagnosis of a brain tumor. To gain an understanding of how processing delays impact social interactions between survivors and others, to identify key practical strategies for how to cope with social skills challenges, and to explore the tools, resources, and technologies available to help survivors and families navigate these challenges. Next slide. Before we start, I want to remind us all of a couple of key points that will carry us forward through today's talk and our larger conversation. First, it's important for us to have a common definition and understanding of social functioning. This is the definition that I use in my work. It is quite simple, but I like the way that it gets to the meat of the construct. So in brief, social functioning is the ability to interact competently with others across settings. These interactions typically involve same-age peers and form the basis for interactions throughout the rest of a child's life. Competence in these interactions is critical to both present and future well-being. Next slide, please. So we have to consider the age of a child when we're talking about social skills. How social skills are developed, learned, and demonstrated by a child will vary significantly by the age of that child. A socially competent interaction will look very different in a 4-year-old as compared to a 16-year-old. We should have very different expectations for what social interactions and peer relationships will look like at different ages. While there are some behaviors that are acceptable and adorable and fantastic when kids are younger, these behaviors are no longer acceptable or appropriate as they get older. And so it's important to target those behaviors to ensure that they're not happening. This is particularly important to remember as we start to think about how we work with children to engage in social interactions and to find friends. The strategies we're going to use will likely differ depending on the age of that child. Next slide, please. So I'd like now to review the different aspects of social functioning that we know that survivors struggle with. First, survivors have weaknesses in neurocognitive functioning, especially in attention, working memory, processing speed, and executive functioning. And these weaknesses absolutely play a role in social functioning. As you might expect, social interactions happen very quickly and can be quite complex. A lot is communicated in a very short amount of time. There's what is being said, but also the facial expressions, tone of voice, body language, what happened immediately before, the context or location of the interaction, and who else may be involved. Is this a one-on-one interaction or are there multiple people? Children who have difficulty paying attention, who have trouble remembering details, or those who think a little more slowly may struggle to keep up with these interactions and can quickly fall behind. Then those with emotion regulation difficulties may struggle to stay calm, to not be impulsive, and to not jump to conclusions when in an interaction, especially one that may not be going positively. Next slide, please. From a social cognitive skills or social skills standpoint, there are three main skills that research has focused on: affect recognition, theory of mind, and problem solving. By far, the most data and research has been done is on affect recognition. We know that survivors of brain tumors struggle to identify facial expressions as compared to typically developing children. We see that they do okay when asked to identify most positive expressions. They know when someone's happy, as well as expressions that are more obvious or intense, such as these in the picture on your left-hand side of your screen, but they really struggle with subtle or negative emotions, such as when someone may be slightly frustrated with them or slightly angry with them. We also have some emerging data that about 40% of survivors are struggling with theory of mind or perspective taking. So they may have trouble figuring out what someone else is feeling or thinking in a situation, and instead may just believe that whatever they are feeling, the other person is feeling. This weakness or deficit really may help us to explain why some of our survivors struggle to engage others in conversation, or really to recognize when a conversation or a topic that they're interested in isn't as interesting to someone else. Finally, we're also starting to see some weaknesses in problem solving or figuring out what to do in a challenging social situation. For example, we asked kids what they would do if they were in a situation where they were trying to play or join other kids in play, but those kids weren't listening to them, as you can see on the picture on the right. We're seeing that they would choose to either ask an adult for help or would just wait until the kids paid attention to them. Neither of these are great options and may actually indicate some difficulties in understanding how to navigate these situations. We're also seeing that some kids sometimes even fail to recognize when they're in these challenging situations. This can then lead to concerns that our kids won't recognize when they're being teased or bullied or manipulated in some way. And therefore, if we're not recognizing that something is happening, it's really hard to figure out what to do in that situation. Next slide, please. Finally, from parent report questionnaires, we start to see the consequences of these skill-based weaknesses. As compared to normative data, parents report that their kids experience more rejection from peers and fewer positive peer interactions, with 30 to 60% of our parents in a recent study indicating problems that are in the clinical range across various measures. So these are issues that are so significant that we really need to intervene and do some things to help. We also see reports of less social awareness and social motivation. So kids are being viewed by their caregivers as being less aware of social interactions with others, as well as just potentially less motivated to engage in these social interactions than their peers are. Ultimately, all of these weaknesses are not going to be seen in every child with a brain tumor. But from a general standpoint, this constellation of symptoms does give us a constellation. It does start to give us a constellation of skill deficits and symptoms that we can start to tease apart and focus on as we're developing intervention. And for each individual child, if we can start to identify their specific concerns, we can start to figure out how to help them succeed socially in the best way possible. Next slide, please. So the skills I've covered, just touched on, are really specific to survivors, kids who are several years off therapy, back at home, engaged, and doing back in their normal environment. But I'd like to switch gears just a bit now and turn our focus to young children, specifically those less than about 6 years of age. Young childhood is a critical period for social emotional development, and many children with brain tumors are diagnosed and treated during this period. Skills learned and developed during this period, including emotion regulation, sharing, problem solving, and conflict resolution, lay the foundation for the continued development and refinement of these skills throughout our lives. Longitudinal research suggests that proficiency in these skills in preschool is actually predictive of not only elementary academic functioning, so your reading and your math scores in elementary school, but also well-being into young adulthood. So this is really a critical period that we need to focus on as we think about social emotional development. Next slide, please. Limited research has focused on this age group, but several qualitative or interview studies have started to paint a picture of the impact of a cancer diagnosis in early childhood. Specifically, young children were described by their parents as lacking understanding of social roles following treatments, having difficulty making friends, and even being confused about how to act on playgrounds, as they hadn't spent a lot of time there during treatment. For those kids who were making friends, parents described relationships that were kind of imbalanced. So the healthy child, or the typically developing child, was almost mothering the cancer child, the cancer survivor, or there was some bossiness. So my group at St. Jude has started to more objectively look at friendships in young children with cancer at the end of treatment, and I'll share some of that data in the next couple of slides. Next slide, please. So children with brain tumors and solid tumors completed assessments of social functioning when they were between the ages of 4 and 6, so our preschoolers and early kindergartners, and 6 to 12 months post-treatment. Children completed tasks assessing social skills, and parents completed questionnaires. Briefly, as you can see here, there were really no differences between our kids with brain tumors and solid tumors on measures of social cognitive skills and parent-reported social functioning. However, when we compare these kids to norms, and that's that black line that you can kind of see in the middle of both slides, our kids with brain tumors perform significantly worse on assessments of theory of mind or perspective taking, as well as behavioral regulation. And their parents reported fewer positive peer interactions and more peer rejection. So this is actually very similar to some of the data that we're seeing in survivors, but this is in our very young kids who are really close to the end of therapy, really suggesting that these deficits that we're seeing in social functioning may be starting quite early for our kids. For our kids with solid tumors, they were not immune to some social issues. They also demonstrated difficulties with behavioral regulation and a trend for weaknesses in affect recognition. Next slide, please. So then we looked at problem solving, just like we do in our older kids. Social problem solving, like I said before, examines how kids approach and think about challenging social situations. In this measure, vignettes depict situations where children are physically provoked, they're pushed, a project is ruined, or socially provoked, like this one. So the child is shown that top picture, and they are told the following story. Mary asked Bobby to play with her, but Bobby said he doesn't want to play with Mary. He's going to play with Tom. Kids are then asked to indicate how they would feel if this happened to them. They would be angry, sad, happy, or just kind of okay. And then they're asked what they would do. So from left to right on your screen, Would you ask if you can play with Tom too? Would you push Bobby and say, you're not my friend? Would you cry? Or would you go play with someone else? Next slide, please. So some interesting patterns emerged in our analyses with our young kiddos. Both children with solid tumors and those with brain tumors were more likely to choose a pro-social response when they were physically provoked. A block tower was knocked over versus when they were socially provoked. They were left out. To us, this suggested that these kids had a pretty good idea of how to act when a slight is obvious. I know I'm not supposed to hit you when you hit me. But they're really less sure of how to act in interactions that are more complicated, like the example in the prior slide. This was especially true for our brain tumor kiddos, who were actually more likely to choose to avoid these situations. Their choice was, I'm going to go find something else to do. I'm not going to deal with Bobby. Ultimately, these findings for us really confirmed that prior qualitative work, that our young kids with cancer, really regardless of diagnosis, may be struggling socially at the end of therapy, and that we may start seeing social deficits, especially in our brain tumor kiddos, emerge very early, even as early as the end of treatment, really highlighting the importance of focusing on social interactions and social skills from a very young age. Social development is a lifelong process. And the more that we can focus on it early and often for our kiddos, the better these kids will be. So next slide, please. So now that we've covered some of the common social challenges in our survivors, for the next part of our talk, I'd like to switch gears and talk about the context, some of the contexts where social interaction takes place. And then I'll end with some practical strategies for promotion of social interaction. So let's talk technology. Next slide, please. As we know, given that we are on a Zoom webinar right now, technology, phones, and social media are ubiquitous. It's everywhere. Greater than 90% of our adolescents in the US have access to a phone, and they spend considerable amounts of time on it throughout the day. There are numerous social media platforms, and they vary in popularity and coolness over time. But these TikTok, Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, online gaming, Reddit are some of the most popular, well-known at this point. You've probably heard of most of these. Research suggests that for most kids, their online network is actually very similar to and is really an extension of their offline or in-person network. They follow and interact with their classmates and friends online, just as they do offline. And we kind of see two broad types of users of social media. Those who are active, posting, engaging, creating content, and those who are observers. They're on it, they check it, they have accounts. It may be a great way to waste time. Had that conversation with the family this morning, but they're really keeping their own lives off of these platforms. So next slide, please. So perhaps the most frequent conversations and concerns among parents and really some professionals is about the safety aspects or risks of online social interaction. Certainly, there are a lot of stories about online bullying, with the risk that the school bullying carries over into online spaces and into evenings and weekends and not just contained to the school day, making it really hard for these kids to escape that negative interaction. There's also risk to oversharing. Impression manipulation. Are people actually who they say they are? There are ridiculous and potentially harmful social media challenges that a lot of kids are engaging in, and many other challenges. There's also always, of course, concerns about the amount of time that we spend on screens, as well as various concerns depending on the age of a child. So thinking very carefully about when our kids are allowed to get their own social media accounts and that type of thing. And the concern, of course, is then that these risks are elevated when dealing with a child who is particularly vulnerable, who may struggle to understand social nuance, and who may not know when they're being manipulated. So that puts them even more at risk and makes them more vulnerable to some of these safety concerns. But rather than hiding from social media, there are instead strategies to help mitigate some of these risks. Continual, frank, and honest conversations, monitoring of accounts. There are lots of apps that allow parents to do this, especially when kids are younger. but maybe even as they get older, especially in a more vulnerable population. It's important to be explicit about concerns and how we manage and interpret things that come through social media. Next slide, please. Because despite its downsides, there are actually a lot of benefits to online social interaction. It can certainly extend an individual's social network, providing opportunities, especially in older adolescents and young adults, to meet others who may be more like them. Really an opportunity to find a community. I've worked with several adolescent and young adult patients whose primary group of friends is through online gaming, and they have very rich relationships in those communities. There are also opportunities to explore different aspects of identity development online, to find new hobbies or interests and to explore those and to connect with others who may have similar interests. And then there may be some benefits for online communication. It can be a little bit slower paced, doesn't involve as many social cues, kind of takes the facial expressions out of it, takes tone of voice out of it, takes body language out of it in many cases. And it may allow for some editing. You can kind of think about what you want to say before you say it. Whereas in an in-person social interaction, things happen very quickly. So for kids who do struggle with social nuances and different types of social interaction, online communication may almost provide some needed accommodations to social interaction that's really harder to come by in those in-person interactions. Next slide, please. So there has really been next to no research on online social interaction in survivors of brain tumors. So instead, I looked into its use in a population of youth who also have social challenges, those with autism spectrum disorders. So a recent paper examined the social media habits of adolescents with ASD as compared to typically developing children. They found that the amount of time that both groups spent on social media was really similar. It was a lot of time. However, the preferred platforms were different, as you can see in these two graphs. So the ASD youth really preferred YouTube, whereas our typically developing kids were actually spending most of their time on Snapchat. The reasons for social media use were also different. For typically developing kids, it was social interaction, and you can see that in their preferred apps. So they're on Snapchat and Instagram, which involves a lot of social interaction. For the ASD kids, it was mainly for entertainment purposes, which is where you would find YouTube. So the comparison here with kids with brain tumors is certainly not perfect. Kids with brain tumors are different than those with ASD. However, the social challenges do have some overlap, and I think we'd see similar answers perhaps if we asked some survivors how they use social media. Next slide, please. A similar paper looked at the engagement of youth with ASD in various activities, including social media, as compared to their siblings. And this paper is about 8 or 9 years old, so social media seems to change by the minute. So this is getting a little outdated, but I think it still works. In the figure, the darker bars on the left-hand side are youth with ASD, and the lighter bars are their siblings. So results indicated that kids with ASD spent significant time watching TV and playing video games, while their siblings spent time with friends or on social media. So again, perhaps we see this is a group of kids that's really not using social media to its fullest extent and is really engaging in those aspects of online media that are more focused on entertainment and not interaction. So there could be some openings for intervention in this space to promote use of the interaction pieces a bit more. Because if all of the kids that, if all of the typically developing kids that our kids are trying to interact with are all on Instagram and Snapchat and TikTok every night, whereas our kids with ASD or our kids with brain tumors are not, they're missing a significant amount of potential social interaction with their peer group. So next slide, please. So for our last bit before we open the webinar up to the Q&A, I just wanted to focus on a couple of key strategies for increasing social engagement and social interaction. The first is activity participation. Kids who are not participating in social interaction will not have the opportunity to make friends. Kids who are not participating in social interactions and having opportunities to interact with their peers will not have an opportunity to make friends. Kids need to be out of their houses and engaged in activities, whatever those are. Doesn't really matter. Sports, music, youth group, 4-H, again, doesn't matter, but there needs to be that opportunity for social interaction in order for there to be an opportunity to make friends. There has to be that opportunity for engagement with others. And this will take engagement from parents and caregivers. It takes oversight, it takes planning, it takes flexibility and creativity to find these opportunities and to advocate for these opportunities. I wish we could make friends appear out of thin air. It would make my life so much easier in some respects, but we can't. And so it takes that engagement and that advocacy, and it takes a little bit of research. And it really may take some creativity to find the community or group of kids that is right for your kid. And that may not be the traditional route. It may likely won't be easy, but there are resources available, including school-based and community services, hospital services, including pediatric psychologists and neuropsychologists at your oncology or survivorship clinic, and support and experiences from other parents who have successfully navigated some of these challenges. So next slide, please. So this is just my contact information, and certainly Kathy and Heather would have it as well. And then one more slide, please. And I will just say thank you for giving me the opportunity to come back to PBTF and talk more about this topic. This is a topic that is very close to my heart. I'm so invested in these kids and figuring out what we can do to help them be more engaged and to make friends and to find their community. And I look forward to the Q&A. So I will pass things back to Heather.
Thank you so much, Dr. Willard, for your presentation and for really building on last October's webinar. I'm Heather Held. I'm the National Family Support Programs Manager for the PBTF, and it gives me great pleasure to now introduce our parents who will be joining Dr. Willard to answer questions from all of you. Parents offer such a valuable perspective on the panel as experts in their own child's journey, knowing firsthand the unique challenges that families face during treatment and afterwards. Jeannie Carlson is mother to 26-year-old Sarah, who was diagnosed with a germinoma brain tumor at age 8. Throughout their journey, the family has always looked for ways to support Sarah academically and socially. Jeannie also focuses on giving back to others on their journeys when possible, having supported the PBTF at in-person programs in California and currently serving as a peer mentor in the PBTF's peer mentoring program. Professionally, Jeannie worked in the biotech industry and retired in 2020. I'm happy to have her with us again today, as she was with us in October. Our other parent today is Kirsten Hicks, mother to 20-year-old Courtney, who was diagnosed with a medulloblastoma at age 8 and fell into posterior fossa syndrome the day after surgery, making her journey all the more complicated. Kirsten and her family have a focus on supporting Courtney's independence and her social activities. Her older brother, Taylor, has been a constant source of encouragement, and Kirsten works with Courtney to make her love of sewing into a business and a way that she can give back to others by making and donating blankets to other brain tumor families. In her professional life, Kirsten is the Vice President of Software Release Management. So we now welcome questions from all of you. Please type any questions you have into the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom window. We have a couple questions that have already come in, and we also have some questions from registration. So let's get started. I'm actually going to start with you, Dr. Willard. We had a question come in while you were speaking about the deficits. And the question is, are these deficits dependent on the type of pediatric brain tumor, or are they really seen across the board?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the answer is a little bit of both. So we have certainly seen that cranial radiation is, of course, a risk factor for increased deficits in neurocognitive concerns, and greater neurocognitive concerns are going to be associated with greater social functioning concerns. But we have also seen deficits, social skills deficits, even in kids who had surgery only. So we have really seen these deficits across the board. We see a few more in kids who are younger at diagnosis, as I talked about. Certainly kids who experience posterior fossa syndrome are a little more at risk. So it really varies. Unfortunately, we haven't, there's so much variability in the social aspects of these kids that we haven't identified the exact kind of phenotype and what types of kids are at risk for what types of deficits. That is a goal for ours as we really expand our research on this topic.
Okay, thank you for that. Kirsten, I'm going to take the next question to you, and then Jeannie, I'd like you to follow up afterwards. Both of you have daughters that are now 20 years and older. And the question is specific to teen development. How do I help my teen develop and identify her own unique identity when it isn't always easy for her to relate to her peers?
So relating to her peers was definitely something she could not do. Her peers would be excited about getting their driver's license. That is not an option for Courtney. They were excited about going to college or going to visit colleges, and that was not in her cards. So we had to find things that she was excited about and that she could go ahead and do. So we built on her love for and her passion for sewing and cooking, and really made her world a little smaller in that aspect, where we did not participate in some things where the main focus was the driving, the dating, the going to see, but we concentrated then with other people and things relating to sewing and cooking. And yes, that's not what this is about, which is increasing your social. I did buffer her a little bit more to protect her, but therefore she got through that phase and is now happy with who she is and knows what she can and can't do. And that was a hardship, but I did buffer her a little bit because I felt like she did not need to go through some of that quote unquote pain of listening to all the things they could do, they being whomever, and she could not. But she's happy with who she is now. So for Courtney, I think it worked.
Thank you. Jeannie?
Very similar in our case. It just wasn't possible for Sarah to keep up the pace of the social interactions with her peers when she was in school, even in elementary school. And it saddened her because she recognized the fact that they just lost interest in her and dropped away. And so similarly, we have just focused on Sarah's passions, like art, and she gets a lot of positive reinforcement for the quality of her art and her volunteering and the various things she's involved in. Everybody loves Sarah. And it was for us, again, just getting through that phase, because adults, especially adult women, Sarah gets along with very well because they tend to draw her out and be interested in what she has to say and help, I guess, mother her through those social interactions. So, I mean, I guess probably typically developing kids go through the same thing. You just have to survive adolescence somehow. And we as moms just help our unique kids survive adolescence in a little different way.
I love that, surviving adolescence. We've had a question come in, and actually it says, I would love to hear both Dr. Willard's perspective as well as the parents. So I'm going to start with you, Dr. Willard. Do you feel like from a hospital and treatment perspective that we as healthcare providers should try to find more ways to encourage the social interaction during the healthcare setting and treatment, especially for younger children, ?
Yes,
Okay.
unequivocally, yes. COVID's made that really hard, but
Yes.
in general, so, you know, if you spend a lot of time in a hospital and here at St. Jude in particular, with our older kids, you get your 8, 9, 10, 15-year-olds in a hospital they know how to make friends. They've done this before. They've kind of figured this out because they've been in school up until the time they got diagnosed. And so when they're sitting in a waiting room or they're in hospital housing, like which is what happens at St. Jude, they're looking around for other kids their own age, or they're on their phones talking to their friends who are back home. And so they're looking for that social interaction. Our younger kids don't have those same experiences. Here at St. Jude, most of those kids are sitting in wagons. They can't even get out. They are trapped in that wagon, which is great for containment, and they're often on tablets as well. And so they're not getting that same type of interaction unless a parent is there to be like, oh, there's another 4-year-old over there. Let's get them together, like playing with some blocks or coloring or something. I think our child life specialists are really great at facilitating some of that interaction, but I think we do it a lot better with our older kids than our younger kids. So that is something we are really starting to focus on here at St. Jude, hopefully as COVID makes its way out to do even more so, but to really start to think about our younger kids who before diagnosis would have been in daycare or would have been on playgrounds and at story groups and library groups and story time and music groups and all of the things, and getting that social interaction, because I think a lot of the weaknesses that we're seeing in these young kids is because they've just kind of been starved for that and haven't had those opportunities to interact with anyone but mom and dad, maybe a sibling if they happen to have one.
Thank you for that. Jeannie, do you have anything you want to add to that from the parent side?
Well, our daughter was 8 when she was diagnosed, so she was a little older than this time frame, but she was very isolated during treatment. It's always difficult because if they're neutropenic, you got to keep them away from people. But reentry was tough because suddenly Sarah was really a different person and was suddenly pretty stripped of her social skills and ability to relate to her peers. So it was tough.
Kirsten, do you have anything to add to that?
I do know one of the things that was said is that the parent needs to go ahead and get the child there. And every time, we heard over announcement, the dog therapy was over here. I would pick Courtney up, put her in her wheelchair, wagon, whichever, take whatever was attached to her, and we would go running out the door if we could and go to those things. We would go down to the koi pond. We would go to arts and crafts where the parent involvement is huge. And you have to get that child. It's not like they can run out the door on their bicycle and run down to their friend's house. The parent is so involved in doing just the basics of getting the child to an event, and then maybe saying, see that person over there? Go talk to them. No, mama, I don't want to. Well, let's go together. And, you have to be there for the whole play date, depending on the situation your child's in. Mine was not moving. She would crawl everywhere. So I had to physically stay there because the other parents panicked. Oh my gosh, what if she falls? I said, she's going to fall. It's just a matter of when she falls, not if she falls. So yes, it is a matter of, in the hospital setting, the hospital provided a lot. You just had to go do it, again, if your child was medically able to go.
Kirsten, I'm gonna jump in. I think that's such a great comment, and so important. And during treatment, we ask a lot of our parents, and so a lot of time the focus is really just on like the physical needs and providing vomit bags and things like that for these kids as they're going through treatment. So we know that asking them to do more, like also focus on getting their child out and interacting with people, is really hard. But a lot of these kids, they're not going to do it on their own. I literally had a conversation with a child this morning who, when I met her last week, was not really interested in making friends while she's here. And her mom was like, you're going to. So that's what's happening. And this week she was like, yeah, I made a friend. My mom made me go up and talk to her in the cafeteria. And she said, you can't watch YouTube until you go talk to this girl. And she's like, and now we meet up and we talk every day. And it's like, perfect. because she would just be on YouTube, or kids are technology, kids are attached to their tablets, it's entertaining, it helps them get through the day, but they need that social interaction too. And it's a skill, I think, as you really talked about, Jeannie, that our kids need to be practicing while they're on treatment and continuing to engage in, so that when they do get back into regular life and try to go back in school and re-entry, it's not such a foreign place as it feels, I think, sometimes for these kids after going through treatment for so long.
Dr. Willard, we had a question come in at registration. Are the gaps in social skills evident immediately, or is this something that occurs over time as the child gets older?
I think we're seeing it more over time. Certainly, as I showed with our young child data, we're starting to see some of it pretty early on. But I think it's something that grows over time. And that's certainly what we see with our neurocognitive deficits, is these kids kind of grow into their deficits over time. So they're continuing to learn new information as they get older, but they're learning new information at a slower pace than their peers. And I think that's also what's happening a little bit with our social skills. So these skills aren't developing as quickly as they are in their peers, or they're kind of getting stuck at kind of where they were when they were diagnosed, or in a couple of years later. And so it's not, these kids aren't going to be diagnosed, just wake up the next day with social skills challenges, but it's really something that's going to develop over time as their kids or as their peers are almost on a different trajectory than they are.
Just piggybacking on that question, and then I'll go back to the parents. Has research shown that there's any specific type of therapy that can help to mitigate or lessen the deficits?
Yeah, unfortunately, our research on interventions for social skills has really not been great. It's really lagged behind. It is a work in progress, but we've really focused more recently on identifying the social issues, because until we identify the exact skills that our kids are struggling with, it's really hard to focus on developing interventions that would help. So there have been some interventions done. There's been some group-based social skills interventions, very typical to what you would see in a community mental health or a school-based system. Kids certainly benefit from those. There's no harm from having them engage in kind of your typical social skill interventions, but they're not specific to the issues that our kids face, and so they're not going to be a complete fix. We have some data suggest that stimulant medication, which can help with attention problems in kids with brain tumors, can also help with their social skills challenges. Just it speeds them up a little bit and gets them a little more focused. But the research is coming, it's just not there yet. And again, I think a lot of it will be, there's going to be kind of different profiles of kids with brain tumors and their social challenges, and kind of picking what is the intervention or what's the treatment that works for this child, and that may not work for the other child.
Okay. Thank you.
And if I could say, for us, intervention didn't pay off that much. And later in Sarah's life, we actually found a better alternative, which was to involve her in activities such as Special Olympics. I hesitated to involve her originally because I thought she might not feel as if she fit. But as Dr. Willard is saying, there are a lot of children with autism in Special Olympics, and our kids do actually pretty well with the social skills. Also, Sarah ended up being a pretty high performer compared to her peers, and she felt really good about, kind of being at the top of the heap. So I recommend looking for alternative places where our kids can shine, and maybe not worry so much about trying to go back into the old social environment and be like you used to be.
I think that's a really, really great point.
Thank you for that. We had a question come up several different ways within registration. Kirsten, I'm going to start with you. the question came in of how do I, as a parent, express to others in my child's life the challenges that she is facing?
Well, with Courtney, some of them are very obvious because she's physically disabled as well as mentally disabled. So you see the wheelchair and right away, you know something's wrong with her. So kids, when she was little, would come up and say, "What's wrong with you?" And mom, she would look at me and say, "Mama, what do I say?" I said, "Your choice. You can explain what's wrong to what degree you want to explain to them." From a parent perspective, I would have to say what her limitations are or what she can or can't do. One of the first things was she was invited to a slumber party. And I said, "Great, I will be there because she's not going without me because there's just too much of a risk." So one of the things you have to do is know the boundaries of your child and then be willing to have parents that accept those boundaries and be willing to say, "Look, there's not one of you coming, but two of you coming to help through." And really, it depends on how much interaction there's going to be with the child. If it's a simple little birthday party, then you don't have to explain as much. If there's more, then you do. At one of the functions, that a Girl Scout function, Courtney was crawling across the floor and 14 parents jumped up to help her. And I'm like, no, that's how she moves. Let her start to figure things out. But thank you. Be there when she falls, but thank you. So it's just a matter of reading each situation. And then now she's at the point where, in theory, she knows her limitations and knows when to ask for help and she kind of knows when she wants to tell people things and when she's like, "No, I'm just in a wheelchair, thank you," and moves on.
Jeannie, can you add to that and Sarah's experience for us?
Yes, and Sarah's completely different. When you look at her physically, you would not see her disabilities at all. And so it becomes, appropriate to try to intervene for her or explain to people to sort of smooth the way sometimes. The first thing we did is obviously be very honest with Sarah about all her disabilities, so nothing is a surprise to her, and also work on her advocating for herself, when appropriate. But there are times like Sarah loves to go trade Disney pins, and she'll be having an interaction with another person that wants to trade a pin. And I can sort of sense that they're getting confused because her reaction is very young. And she has a very hard time making decisions. So I will, if appropriate, sort of talk to them on the side and say she's a brain tumor survivor, and but she loves Disney pins, and people are generous at that point. But again, of course, that's not kids and peers; it's more adults who are, as a whole, more generous to our kids.
Let me ask you, Jeannie, I'm going to stick with you for just a minute, and then I'd love for Dr. Willard to piggyback on this. Suggestions for helping survivors who are in their 20s to develop those social skills later in life. The child looks like was diagnosed at 8 and is now in their 20s.
I don't know that I have any cures. What has worked for us is to help Sarah follow her passions, and her passions have led her to be successful in a lot of different environments and to be appreciated. And where she's high functioning and shines, that makes her feel good. So we didn't have her go to community college because there was no way she was ever going to get a college degree and be independently supported. Instead, we focus on having her have opportunities with art. She turns out she was naturally really good with young children, junior high kids, that sort of thing. And that's worked into a job for her. And not only do the kids love her, but the other adults that she's working with really, love the way that she works with kids. The interactions with peers are frankly still tough. And one thing I recommend, or I have seen other people do, is you may have to hire a best friend, pay someone to come in and pay attention to your kid. It's kind of heartbreaking, but it can work. And again, other outlets like Special Olympics have been wonderful for Sarah.
Dr. Willard, would you like to add anything to that from the professional side, please?
Yeah, I think it's a really great question. And I think Jeannie's approach of recognizing that the traditional road was not going to be her daughter's road and being okay with that and finding alternatives. And I think that's such a great way to approach it, is to find, like, what is my kid good at? What are they passionate about? And then how can we find something that matches that? And it's not going to look like a 4-year college and a 9-to-5 job. And I'm okay with that. And I think that is so important for our parents to support our kids in figuring that out. For assistance with that, certainly a neuropsychological evaluation can be helpful for our young adults. You can find referrals for that through your hospital survivorship clinic. I think that can be really helpful in figuring out some cognitive strengths and weaknesses and kind of figuring out where some issues are and what accommodations might be needed. And then things like vocational rehab, which are opportunities in most cities, can also help with things like job placement. And again, strengths and weaknesses and figuring out what might be a way to approach employment for a young adult.
Thank you for that. We have another question from someone in the hospital setting. Dr. Willard, can you offer suggestions on how to help parents engage and buy into the idea of seeking out and participating in activities that really lend for the social interactions for patients?
Yeah, I haven't necessarily had to convince parents they're important. So that's a good thing. Most parents, when I chat with them, they're the ones pushing it. So they're like, so when my kid was at home, we were doing this, this, and this. How do we make that happen in the hospital? And it's like, fantastic, I love you. So I think, but I think for some parents, it can be helpful to almost get a prescription of sorts from your medical team to be like, yes, your kid is sick. Yes, your kid is in treatment, but this is part of their treatment. We need to support this piece of them. And yes, it is okay for them to go play with a friend, to participate in this art and craft activity, to attend doggy days, to whatever it is. So I think that can sometimes be helpful from a medical team perspective. And again, as much as we ask our parents to do, our medical teams are focusing on 100,000 different things in that kid's care. And I think sometimes that piece gets missed. But I think for some parents, that, as I said, prescription from the medical team to say, yes, this is important. Please encourage your kid and let us help you make this happen. Here are the resources within the hospital that you can talk to. Let me get a child life specialist in here, or a social worker in here, or a psychologist in here to help you facilitate this. Can go a long way in making a parent feel a little more comfortable with focusing on those aspects.
Thank you for that. So it looks like we have time for just one last question. I'm actually going to start with Kirsten and then have Jeannie wrap it up. But this came in from a parent. How do you talk to your child about their neurocognitive deficits after a brain tumor? And I would say, Kirsten, not only how have you talked to Courtney, but how has that changed over the years as she's gotten a little bit older?
That's what I was just going to say. When she was out of the hospital, she couldn't walk, couldn't talk. We brought her home and I thought, oh my gosh, what am I going to do with this baby that is 80 pounds? And then as she developed and as she started getting to the point where she could walk and she could talk, we did a lot of sign language. We then worked with her on, you can do this, you can't do this at this moment. Very little do I shut the door on what you can't do. Driving is one of those I'm trying to shut the door on because she really wants to, because she knows it's linked to independence. I told her Uber will be her friend. We will get her a driver. But it will change as the child progresses through life and as they see their disabilities. What I don't do is put a stop on what she can't do. We will be in a grocery store and she'll need something. And I'm like, I'm not wearing a green shirt. I don't work here. See that person over there? You need to go. Self-advocating. So I do think you need to let your child know what their limitations are and set boundaries, but also let them push the boundaries because you don't know how far the child can go. And I try really hard to support her, but be there when she falls, be that safety net.
Wonderful. Jeannie, can you share a little bit about Sarah's journey in your conversation?
Yes, as I said before, we've always been very honest with Sarah about what her situation is, what her disabilities are. She can sort of forget sometimes and feel badly that she's not going to college like her brother or other friends. We did have her in a high school for children with mild to moderate disabilities, and that was really helpful because they did work on having each child understand their disability and be able to talk about it and advocate for it. And it's just a matter as parents to feel completely okay with our kid as they are and be able to build them up and talk positively about them and have them feel the same way. And of course, always be truthful so that they don't get blindsided.
Thank you for that. Thank you. Well, we are at the end of our time. I would like to thank Dr. Victoria Willard for her time joining us again today and for sharing your expertise and experience with us. And thank you, Kirsten and Jeannie, for providing such meaningful personal insights from your journeys with Sarah and Courtney. I also want to thank all of our attendees today for your participation and your thoughtful questions. We will be sending you a link to the recording of the webinar and also send the slides to the email address that you registered with. We do have several resources to help with your educational and survivorship needs. Our survivorship resource guidebook provides comprehensive information and practical resources for survivors and families as they navigate the survivorship journey. This valuable resource can be requested in a hard copy or downloaded online. We do also have virtual support groups for families, and those will be resuming next Tuesday. They are held every other week at 4 p.m. Eastern Time for 75 minutes, and they're facilitated by a veteran parent in this journey. And finally, our family support webinars feature carefully chosen experts with information and resources relevant to the brain tumor journey, just like today. Past and upcoming webinar information is available on our website. You have about 2 years of webinars that you can refer back to at this point. So that is a rather robust library, and we will continue to build on it for you. Thank you for attending our webinar today, and please feel free to reach out to our family support team at the PBTF if there's anything we can do to help you. Thank you so much and have a great day.